Hello. So in this video, we're going to be talking about Sophocles' play Antigone. This is the last of the so-called Theban cycle, following Oedipus the king, and then Oedipus at Colonus, and then Antigone. As I said in my previous two videos about Oedipus the king and Oedipus at Colonus, this is not a proper trilogy because these plays were written at dramatically different points in Sophocles' career. Antigone was written sort of mid-career for Sophocles, probably when he was around 50 or so. And out of the 120-some plays, this is probably about 32nd of the plays that he's read, or that he's written. So this is a pretty sort of early mid-stage play for Sophocles. It's written about 15-16 years before Oedipus the king, which is then written about a decade and a half to 2 decades before Oedipus at Colonus. So the plays are chronologically separated. They're at very different points in Sophocles' career, and so we do get some inconsistencies. Nevertheless, they are part of the same myth cycle, and so even though there are differences, they're interconnected. They have the same or similar shared sets of characters and things like this. So, Antigone, the play. Basically what happens is at the end of the Seven Against Thebes campaign, which we get in, for instance, Aeschylus's play Seven Against Thebes, the two sons of Oedipus, Eteocles and Polynices, have killed one another in battle. Eteocles fighting to defend Thebes, and Polynices fighting at the head of the Argive army to conquer it and reestablish his right to the monarchy. Creon, who is Jocasta's brother, is now the king of Thebes as the next in line, and he establishes an edict that Eteocles will be buried with full state honors, but Polynices' body will be left to rot in the fields because he was attacking Thebes. Now, for the ancient Greeks, this was a terrible, terrible punishment. Like, you did not leave bodies unburied. It basically destroyed the soul's ability to get to the afterlife. So it was a punishment beyond death. Antigone, Polynices' brother, also daughter of Oedipus, daughter and sister of Oedipus, determines that she is going to bury Polynices' brother, even though the penalty for violating Creon's edict is death. She does this, she gets caught. Creon sentences her to be walled up in a cave with a small amount of food and water, and that's going to be the way that she dies. The chorus, and it's hard to really judge the position of the people of Thebes, because Haemon, who's Creon's son, at one point comes on and basically says, hey, people in the streets are saying Antigone's right, you shouldn't be killing her for burying her brother, which is fundamentally a good thing anyway. And so this is the sort of central conflict. The chorus is on the fence because they, on the one hand, support Creon and the sort of central ethical idea that the power of the state must be obeyed in order to maintain stability, but they also see Antigone's ethical arguments about divine law and the importance of honoring family. Anyway, so Creon has Antigone walled up. The seer Tiresias comes on and is basically like, hey Creon, you're making a giant mistake, and it's going to cost you a lot of blood. Creon is initially unreceptive to this, But then once Tiresias leaves, Creon's basically like, you know what? I should actually probably bury Polynices and get Antigone out of that tomb, which he then goes to do. But he's too late. When they get to the tomb, he finds that Antigone has hanged herself, and his son Haemon is there. Haemon first tries to kill Creon and then kills himself, as you do in Greek tragedy. People kill themselves all the time. Antigone kills herself, Creon kills himself. Then when news gets back to Thebes, Creon's wife kills herself. So Creon basically ends the play a broken, shattered husk of a human being. Like, he's lost everything that he thought he had to live for. And he recognizes that it's his fault, that his intransigence is what has led him to this terrible fate. Now, Antigone is an interesting play, in part because it's probably written about by more philosophers and critical theorists than almost any other work in history. It's been the basis of so many theories, so many arguments, in part because it is such an interesting play. But I also feel like a lot of people get this play wrong because I think there's a tremendous desire to oversimplify both Antigone and Creon. So Bertolt Brecht, for instance, in his version of Antigone, which I did a video about before, he gives us a very, very straightforward Antigone is an anti-authoritarian figure and Creon is a figure of absolutist or totalitarian authority. Now, Brecht is writing in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and so this is thematically relevant for him. But I think this represents a very common strand in thinking about these characters. Even Paul Roche, in his introduction to this Signet Classics edition, says, she, that's Antigone, will forever be a symbol of the rights of the individual ranged against authoritarian power. Now, I'll show you the basis. We can talk about the basis for this, and it's actually pretty straightforward. But I actually think it's wrong in many ways. So the basis for this argument is that Antigone asserts the rights of herself, the rights of her sort of religious rights or theologically based rights, the right of her family to burial, etc., against the power of the state. Whereas Creon says, in order, and Creon actually gives, I'll skip directly to this bit with Creon. Creon has a very one-dimensional view of state power for at least part of this play. He says, I will not break my word to Thebes. She dies. This is talking to Haemon, who's basically come to try and convince him to show flexibility. She dies. So let her plead to Zeus the sanctity of kindred ties. How can I, if I nurse sedition in my home, not foster it outside? No, if a man can keep his home in hand, he proves his competence to keep the state. But one who breaks the law and flouts authority I will never allow. Unswerving submission to whoever the state has put in charge is what is asked, in little things as well as great, in right and wrong. And I am confident that one who thus obeys and will make a perfect subject or a perfect king, the kind of man who in the thick of flying spears never flinches from his post and stands dauntless at his comrade's side. So this is essentially Creon's theory of state authority, that it should be obeyed absolutely without question. Now, this is actually really interesting because a few lines later he says, let us then defend authority and not be ousted by a girl. If yield we must, then let it be to men, and never have it said we were worsted by a woman. Now that's an interesting complication of his position about absolute authority, because it suggests that this absolute authority that he demands is not that absolute, but is in fact patriarchal or misogynistic. And I'm going to come back to some of the gender dynamics of this play, because I think they're more complicated than people often give them credit for as well. So that's Creon's perspective. He is very much in favor of absolute state authority. And it's often, while what Antigone herself sort of stands for is often hotly debated, whether it's individualism, early feminism, religious liberty, sort of anarchic freedom, whatever it is, she's often seen as a symbol of resistance, but I'm not actually sure that she is. It seems to me that she's not a symbol of, or not advocating for any freedom beyond her own personal right to do what she thinks is necessary in this specific instance. And that's maybe a controversial claim. In fact, that's almost certainly not something a lot of readers would agree on. But I think it's worth noting, this passage to me is super, super important. This is as Antigone is going to her death. She's talking to the chorus and trying to sort of explain herself and her sort of vision of herself. She says, "No husband dead and gone, no children lisping mother could ever have forced me to withstand the city to its face. By what law do I assert so much? Just this. A husband dead, another can be found, a child replaced, but once a brother's lost, mother and father dead and buried too, no other brother can be born or grows again. This is my principle, which Creon stigmatized as criminal, my principle for honoring you, my dearest brother." So this is really interesting, and I think this passage often gets sort of swept under the rug in readings of Antigone, because she's saying very directly here, this is not about family as such, this is not about religious rights or individual freedom, this is about the specificity of Polynikes, the specificity of my brother. Because my parents, Oedipus and Jocasta, are both dead, I can never have another. And so that's the reason I defied the state. She's not arguing here for people in general should be able to defy the state in the name of family or religious liberty or personal conscience or whatever it is. She's not even saying I should be able to defy the state across the board. She's saying this one instance, the specificity of this single set of circumstances, means that I had to defy the law. And I think that's a really crucial point here. Because she's not the anti-authoritarian rebel that someone like Brecht makes her out to be. She's simply not saying the authority of the state cannot control people or that people need individual liberty or something like this. She's saying there's one instance in which I believe that I'm justified in doing this. Now, this is also complicated by other things that Antigone has said. And in particular, I think this view has fallen out of fashion, but there's an older view that Antigone is a character in love with death. I think a lot of people still sort of believe this on some level, but it's lost a lot of critical purchase, I think. But I actually think there's something to this. And I think it goes along with this idea that Antigone is not making a case for general liberty or general religious freedom or support of family in general, that she's very much only concerned with a particular set of circumstances related to her, rather than establishing a general principle. So at the beginning of the play, when she initially requests her sister Ismene's help with burying Polynikes' body, Ismene doesn't want to do it because she recognizes that Antigone and Ismene are the last of the House of Oedipus, and that they have, as a line, they have been cursed, and so she does not want to pursue death the way that the rest of her family has, which to me personally is a perfectly reasonable approach to life, but it's not necessarily the stuff of tragedy. So after this, Antigone says, "I will not press you anymore. I would not want you as a partner even if you ask. Go to what you please." So that's actually really an interesting point. This, "I would not want you as a partner if you ask." Because one of the things about the Antigone as anti-authoritarian, Creon as authoritarian schema is that it has to see Creon as inflexible. But Antigone is probably the most inflexible character of the play. She is willing to make no compromise whatsoever. And that's significant. We'll get to that in a couple of different ways in this passage. "Go to what you please. I go to bury him. How beautiful to die in such pursuit, to rest by him whom I have loved, sinner of a holy sin, with longer time to charm the dead than those who live, for I shall abide forever there." And then slightly later, Ismene says, "At least tell no one what you do, but keep it dark, and I shall keep it secret too." And Antigone says, "Oh, tell it, shout it out. I'd hate your silence more than if you told the world." So here's the thing. Ismene's perfectly reasonable here. If Antigone's goal is to give rights to Polynices' body, if her goal is a religious or familial obligation to honor the dead, there's no inherent reason that she has to make that deed known. She can do that, not get caught, because she doesn't get caught the first time she buries Polynices' body. This is her seeking death. It's not good enough that she violates Creon's edict, that she goes out and buries this body, which is what she says she feels compelled to do. She also demands that she be executed for it, effectively. I mean, that's what's going on here. And so this, for me, raises questions about whether or not burying Polynices' body, whether or not these religious rites, this familial obligation, is really Antigone's motive. I mean, if that was the motive, it would be enough to bury the body, pour libations, and then go home. You don't have to go out in the streets and be like, "I, Antigone, have violated the edict and deserve to die." But that's what essentially she does. So, I mean, again, I'm not necessarily sold on the idea that individual freedoms are her primary motive here. The other thing that I think people often sort of miss or sweep under the rug with the individual freedom versus totalitarianism reading is that Creon is actually quite flexible. He actually does change his mind pretty continuously throughout the play. I mean, he initially says, "I have to maintain order, I have to have absolute authority," etc., etc. But he decides initially he's going to have both Antigone and Ismene executed. But then the chorus is like, "You do not mean to kill them both." And Creon's like, "You're right, not the one who did not meddle." So that's literally all it took to get him to change his mind. He's hardly this sort of authoritarian strongman who's actually sort of following through on this plan. The chorus was basically just like, "Hey, maybe don't kill Ismene, who didn't do anything." And Creon's like, "Yeah, I guess you're right." And then after Tiresias comes in and says, "Creon, this is not going to work out for you." I mean, while Tiresias is on stage, Creon berates him and accuses him of taking bribes for false prophecies. But then basically the second that Tiresias leaves, Creon's like, I should go bury that body and let Antigone out of the tomb. Like, he is a much more flexible character than Antigone, who refuses any compromise. He's a much more flexible ruler than Oedipus. He's much more flexible than Oedipus at Colonus. These are characters who refuse to compromise. And who knows, maybe if Creon had stuck to his principles and said, yeah, execute them both, fuck if I care, maybe he would have come out better. Who knows? Maybe that's the moral of the story, is follow your bad decision to the end the way Oedipus and Antigone do. But I kind of don't think so, because it doesn't work out that well for them either. The other thing I want to talk about very, very briefly with this play is the gender politics, because another way that this is often read is as a feminist play of Antigone, the female character, fighting patriarchal authority embodied in Creon. But, as Judith Butler very astutely points out in her book Antigone's Claim, this actually doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the play, because the gender roles seem strangely maybe reversed, or maybe just fuzzy. So at one point the chorus in the first choral ode, the chorus talks about all of these things that humanity does, or more specifically that men do in ancient Greece. Farming, sailing, doing all this stuff. And one of the things that Roche's informative note here says is by their listing all the predominantly masculine occupations, sailing, plowing, hunting, fishing, domesticating animals, verbal skills, building, making laws, they're advising women like Antigone to beware of taking on what they consider male roles. And that's actually one of Butler's big arguments here, is that Antigone is entering the public sphere. She is using rhetoric. She is debating, and she is challenging state policy in a way that, especially in Athens, women would not have done. So in the Athens where this play premiered, women would not have had a political voice. And so Antigone is challenging that. She's entering this male sphere, and she takes on these masculine characteristics of using rhetoric, arguing policy, etc., etc. But Creon also has these very interesting feminine components. So, like, at one point, he says of Antigone, "Oh, she's the man, not I, if she can flout authority and walk away unscathed." And then if we go back to the bit that I had read you earlier, with Creon's sort of stated philosophy, he says, "How can I, if I nurse sedition in my house, not foster it outside? No, if a man can keep his home in hand, he proves his competence to keep the state." So this is interesting, because in the ancient Greek world, oikos, which was the home, or sort of responsibility for the home, was the sphere of women. Men were not in charge of what we would call home economics, which was the maintenance of the home. Men were not in charge of that in ancient Greece, or at least in ancient Athens. That was a female sphere. Men were obviously connected to this in some way as husbands and sons and fathers and things like this. But it was basically women who were responsible for keeping the household running. And in this passage, Creon says, if I can keep my household running, that signals that I can lead the state. In other words, if I can do a woman's task, that signals that I can do a man's task. So that's an interesting reversal of what we might expect for the gender roles here.